The date is May 16th, 1811. The location is a nondescript muddy ridge in the province of Extremadura, Spain, overlooking the village of Albuera. The morning air is heavy, saturated with the moisture of a storm that had raged throughout the previous night, leaving the ground a sodden mire that pulls at the boots of the infantry. Visibility is poor. A thick grey mist clings to the hillsides, obscuring the movements of thousands of men and shielding the approach of an approaching catastrophe. This is not the sun-drenched Spain of travel brochures. It is a cold, damp killing ground where the fate of the Peninsular War currently hangs by a thread. On the crest of this ridge stands a line of men dressed in fading red coats with yellow facings. They are the 57th Regiment of Foot, the West Middlesex. They are not yet heroes. They are not yet legends. To the casual observer, they are simply another battalion of King George III's infantry, shivering in the damp air, checking the flints of their brown Bess muskets to ensure the powder has remained dry. They are tired, hungry, and far from the slums and alleyways of London where many of them were recruited. But in the next 4 hours, these men will endure a trial of violence so concentrated and so intimate that it will alter the identity of the British Army forever. Across the valley, the French army under Marshal Soult is moving. They are not sending skirmishers or probing attacks. They are launching a massive, concentrated hammer blow designed to smash the Allied line in a single motion. The French infantry, seasoned veterans of Napoleon's conquests, are advancing in dense columns, massive blocks of men, deep and narrow, designed to punch through a thin defensive line through sheer weight of numbers and psychological terror. The rumble of their drums and the tramp of thousands of boots creates a low-frequency vibration that can be felt in the chest of every British soldier waiting on the ridge. The 57th is positioned in the centre of the British brigade commanded by Major General Daniel Houghton. To their left and right stand the 29th and the 48th regiments. They are the stopper in the bottle. The plan relies on the standard British tactical doctrine. Hold the high ground, wait for the French columns to close the distance, and then unleash disciplined, rolling volleys of musketry to shatter the dense enemy formations. It is a tactic that relies entirely on nerve. If the line breaks, the battle is lost. If the men flinch, the column will roll over them like a tidal wave. As the French columns emerge from the mist and the artillery begins to roar, the sensory overload is immediate. The air fills with the sharp, sulphurous stench of black powder. Cannonballs, fired at close range, begin to plough furrows through the wet earth and the ranks of waiting men. The sound is a deafening, continuous roar, a mix of exploding shells, the rattle of musketry, and the screams of the wounded. But the 57th does not move. They have been drilled for this. They stand in 2 ranks, shoulder to shoulder, their world reduced to the backs of the men in front of them and the commands of their officers. Among them rides Colonel William Inglis, a Scotsman of fierce temperament and unyielding standards. He knows the character of the men under his command. He knows they are rough, often difficult men, drawn from the hard edges of society. But he also knows that they possess a peculiar, stubborn pride. As the French infantry closes to within 60 yards, point-blank range for the smooth-bore muskets of the era, Inglis watches the enemy wave, crest the hill. He does not know that by sunset, 2 out of every 3 men standing in his formation will be dead or wounded. He does not know that the regimental colours, currently flying proud and pristine above the smoke, will be reduced to tattered shreds, held together by little more than loyalty. This is the moment of contact. The French columns halt and deploy into line to return fire. The British muskets level. The order is given. A sheet of flame erupts from the ridge, sending thousands of lead balls slamming into the French ranks. The Battle of Albuera has begun in earnest, and the 57th Regiment of Foot is about to step into the furnace. But to understand how a group of London labourers and Middlesex toughs could stand firm in the face of such annihilation, we must first look back, away from the blood-soaked ridge of 1811, to the origins of the regiment and the iron-hard discipline that forged them. To comprehend the sheer immovability of the 57th Regiment at Albuera, one must understand the iron that was hammered into their spines long before they ever set foot in Spain. The unit was not born in glory, but in the bureaucratic shuffling of the expanding British Empire. Raised in 1755, initially as the 59th Foot, they were renumbered shortly after to the 57th, gaining the county title West Middlesex. This geographic designation was more than a name. It was a destiny. While other regiments drew from the rural peasantry of the shires or the rugged clans of the Scottish Highlands, the 57th drew heavily from the urban sprawl of London and its surrounding areas. The men who filled the ranks of the West Middlesex were often the unwanted sons of the Industrial Revolution. They were labourers from the smoky brickworks, dockworkers from the Thames, and petty criminals escaping the hangman's noose or the debtor's prison. In the eyes of polite society, they were the dregs of the earth. The Duke of Wellington himself would famously describe the army recruited from such classes as the scum of the earth, though he would admit that it was truly wonderful what could be made of them. The 57th was the embodiment of this transformation. Life within the regiment was a brutal existence governed by the bloody code of military law. In the 18th and early 19th centuries, discipline in the British Army was enforced with the lash. Flogging was the standard punishment for crimes ranging from drunkenness to insubordination. The entire battalion would form a hollow square to witness the offender tied to the halberds, stripped to the waist, and whipped with the cat o' nine tails. It was a gruesome theatre designed to instill absolute obedience, but in the 57th, it produced a strange, dark byproduct. The regiment earned a reputation for stoicism that bordered on the inhuman. The soldiers of the 57th prided themselves on their ability to endure the lash without uttering a sound. As the heavy knotted cords struck their backs, tearing skin and muscle, the men of the West Middlesex would bite down on leather or lead bullets, refusing to give their officers the satisfaction of a scream. This grim fortitude earned them their first, and perhaps most telling nickname, the Steelbacks. It was a title whispered in the taverns and barracks of the army, a recognition that these men were harder than the wood and iron of their own muskets. Visually, they were distinct but unassuming. They wore the standard red coat of the line infantry, distinguished by facings, collars and cuffs, of a bright, cheerful yellow. This splash of colour belied the hard men inside the uniforms. They were not the dashing light infantry in green, nor were they the shock troops in kilts. They were the line. Their role was not to skirmish or to raid, but to function as a human brick in a larger wall. Their tactical doctrine required them to suppress their natural survival instincts entirely. They were trained to march and to fire, halt, dress their lines to perfection, and manipulate their muskets with robotic precision while comrades fell around them. The officer commanding this rough collection of Londoners was Lieutenant Colonel William Inglis. Inglis was a career soldier, a man who understood that leading the Steelbacks required a specific kind of leadership. He did not coddle them. He was a strict disciplinarian who upheld the harsh regime of the lash when necessary. Yet, a complex bond existed between the colonel and his fighting villains. He knew their character was forged in hardship. He knew that the same stubbornness that made them difficult to manage in peacetime made them immovable in war. He trusted that when the order was given to stand, the Steelbacks would stand until the world ended. As the 57th marched across the Iberian Peninsula, participating in the long, grueling campaigns against Napoleon's marshals, this identity solidified. They marched over dust-choked roads under the baking Spanish sun, their yellow facings stained with sweat and dirt. They slept in the mud and ate maggot-ridden biscuits. They endured the boredom of the bivouac and the terror of the skirmish. But all of this was merely a prelude. The years of harsh discipline, the pride of the Steelback tradition, and the silent covenant between Inglis and his men were all converging on a single point in time. They were marching toward a low ridge near the village of Albuera, where the concept of endurance would be redefined. The Battle of Albuera did not begin with the orderly precision of a chessboard. It began in chaos, blinded by the elements. On that morning, a violent rainstorm swept across the valley, turning the streams into torrents and rendering the muskets of the skirmishers erratic. Marshal Beresford, commanding the Allied army, had been outmaneuvered. He had expected the main French attack to come against the village of Albuera itself, in the centre, but Marshal Soult, the Duke of Dalmatia, and one of Napoleon's most capable lieutenants, had fainted. While a diversionary force attacked the village, the massive weight of the French Corps hooked around the Allied right flank, aiming to roll up the line and crush the army against the river. The situation on the ridge was critical. The Spanish regiments holding the right flank fought bravely, but were being slowly ground down by the superior weight of the French columns. A British brigade under Colonel Colborne was sent to support them, but disaster struck. As Colborne's men deployed, a squall of rain and hail lashed down, masking the thunder of hooves. The feared Polish lancers and French hussars burst out of the mist, catching the British infantry in line, unable to form defensive squares. In minutes, 3 British regiments were virtually annihilated, ridden down and speared by lances in the driving rain. The right flank was dissolving. The road to the rear was open. Total defeat seemed inevitable. It was into this swirling catastrophe that Major General Houghton's brigade, comprising the 29th, the 48th and the 57th, was ordered to advance. They were the last fresh reserve available to plug the gap. As the 57th began their march up the gentle slope of the ridge, they passed the debris of the earlier fighting. Riderless horses galloped through the smoke. Wounded men from the destroyed regiments staggered past them, their uniforms torn and bloodied, offering a grim preview of what lay ahead at the crest. The men of the West Middlesex did not break step. The drums beat a steady rhythm, attempting to impose order on the growing anarchy of the battlefield. As they neared the summit, the air grew thick with a new, terrifying sound, the buzzing of musket balls, like a swarm of angry hornets, and the deeper, tearing noise of canister shot. The French artillery had brought their guns forward, dangerously close to the infantry fight. They were firing canister, tin cans packed with musket balls that burst upon leaving the cannon muzzle, turning each gun into a giant shotgun. The slope was being raked by this deadly hail, stripping the wet grass and flesh alike. The 57th crested the rise and immediately found themselves face to face with the enemy. The distance was shockingly short. Less than 60 yards separated the British line from the leading ranks of the French columns. The French, confident from their destruction of Colborne's brigade, were pushing forward, a massive blue block of humanity, topped with shakos and bayonets. But instead of continuing their momentum, the French column stalled. They had run into the human wall. The 57th, alongside the 29th and 48th, halted. They did not charge, they did not skirmish. In a display of supreme discipline, they dressed their ranks, levelled their muskets, and unleashed a devastating volley. The front rank of the French column seemed to evaporate, shattered by the concentrated lead. But the French were deep, thousands of men pushing from behind. The dead were stepped over, and the French returned fire. This was the beginning of the firefight, a term that in the Napoleonic era usually implied a brief exchange before a charge. But at Albuera, the clock stopped. The 57th did not advance, and they refused to retreat. The French column could not deploy into a line to bring all their muskets to bear, and they could not punch through the British discipline. The two sides became locked in a static duel of attrition. The wind had dropped, and the heavy smoke from thousands of black powder weapons hung low, trapping the combatants in a sulphurous white room. Men could barely see the enemy they were killing. They fired at the orange flashes in the fog. For the soldiers of the 57th, the world shrank to the mechanical process of loading and firing. Bite the cartridge, pour the powder, ram the ball, prime, cock, present, fire. It was a rhythm of death performed under a sleet of metal. The French artillery was now firing canister directly into the 57th's ranks. Gaps appeared in the line instantly, 5, 10 men down in a second. The sergeants, armed with pikes, stepped in, pulling the survivors together, closing the files. Close up! Close up! It was the constant cry. The line shrank, becoming shorter with every volley, but it remained unbroken. They were standing in the open, trading lives for time, and the bill was coming due. The intensity of the firefight on the ridge had reached a pitch that defied military logic. By all conventions of warfare, one side should have broken by now. The human instinct for self-preservation typically overrides discipline when casualties reach a certain threshold, usually around 30%. But the 57th had long since passed that mark, and still, they stood. The grass beneath their boots was slick with blood, making the simple act of standing firm physically difficult. The noise was so deafening that commands could no longer be heard. They had to be felt, passed by the touch of a sergeant's hand or the wave of a sword. In the centre of this maelstrom, the regimental colours, the king's colour and the regimental colour, were drawing fire like magnets. In 1811, the flags were not merely ceremonial. They were the tactical heart of the regiment, the rallying point that told every soldier where the centre lay. To lose the colours was the ultimate disgrace. To capture them, the ultimate prize. The ensigns carrying them were falling one after another. Ensign Jackson, carrying the king's colour, was hit multiple times. As he fell, another officer or sergeant would snatch the staff from his hands before the silk could touch the bloody mud. The flags themselves were disintegrating, shredding into ribbons under the storm of French musketry. It was in this desperate moment that Colonel William Inglis was struck. He had been riding along the line, a conspicuous target on his horse, urging his men to hold. A charge of canister shot from a French gun slammed into him, the iron balls tearing into his neck and shoulder. The impact was massive, knocking him from his mount and leaving him critically wounded on the ground. The pain would have been excruciating, the shock enough to render most men unconscious. His aides rushed to him, preparing to carry him to the rear, away from the slaughter, to the surgeons who might save his life. But Inglis refused. He knew with a clarity that only comes at the threshold of death that his regiment was teetering on the brink. They were the steelbacks, yes, but they were watching their friends die by the dozen. If their commander left them now, the line might finally snap. Inglis struggled to sit up, the blood pouring from his wounds. He ordered his men to leave him where he was, positioned directly in front of the tattered colours. He wanted to be the last thing his men saw before they stared down the French barrels. Propped up, perhaps leaning against a wheel or supported by a faithful soldier, Inglis looked up at the dwindling line of his West Middlesex men. His voice, fighting against the roar of battle and his own failing strength, rang out with a command that would echo through history. Die hard, 57th, die hard! It was not a command to attack. It was not a promise of victory. It was a brutal, honest instruction to accept their fate. He was asking them to do the one thing they had been trained for, the one thing their harsh lives and the steelback discipline had prepared them for, to stand and die rather than yield a single inch of ground. The effect was electric. The words rippled down the line, shouted by sergeants and repeated by the privates. Die hard became a mantra, a chant that cut through the terror. The men of the 57th, the fighting villains of London, responded with a renewed, ferocious stoicism. They closed ranks over the bodies of their comrades. They stepped over the dead to fill the gaps. The rate of fire increased. The line, though thinner and more ragged, solidified into something harder than rock. The French, looking across the narrow gap of death, could not understand it. They were pouring fire into the British ranks, seeing men fall in heaps, yet the red wall remained. The psychological impact began to shift. The French columns, crowded and unable to move, were suffering heavily from the British volleys. But more than the physical damage, It was the morale shock. They were fighting men who refused to acknowledge they were beaten. They were fighting men who were apparently willing to die to the last man. The diehards were born in that bloody hour, not in a moment of triumph, but in a crucible of sacrifice. The arrival of the 4th Division, the Fusilier Brigade, finally broke the deadlock. Advancing on the flank of the exhausted French columns, fresh British troops poured a withering fire into the enemy mass, turning the stalemate into a rout. The French, battered and demoralized by their inability to break the stubborn line on the ridge, began to crumble, slowly at first, and then in a chaotic surge, Soult's army turned and fled back down the slope, leaving the bloody height in the possession of the British. The roar of battle, which had been a continuous deafening thunder for hours, began to recede, replaced by the crying of the wounded and the low moans of the dying. As the smoke drifted away, carried off by the returning wind, the true cost of the 57th stand was revealed. It was a sight that sickened even the most hardened veterans. On the patch of ground assigned to the West Middlesex, the dead did not lie scattered as they usually did in battle, dispersed by panic or maneuver. Instead, they lay in ghastly, perfect rows. They had fallen exactly where they stood in the ranks. The line of red coats on the grass mirrored the formation they had held in life. They had died keeping their dressing. It was said that a visitor to the battlefield could walk along the line of corpses and determine the exact position of the companies simply by looking at the facings on the uniforms of the dead. The numbers were catastrophic. Of the approximately 570 officers and men of the 57th who had marched up the hill that morning, over 420 were casualties. Only around 150 men remained standing, unwounded or lightly wounded enough to hold a musket. The regiment had ceased to exist as a fighting unit. It was now a skeleton crew guarding a graveyard. The casualty rate hovered near 75%, a figure that usually signifies the total annihilation of a military force. Yet, the 57th had not been annihilated. They had simply absorbed the metal and stayed put. Marshal Beresford, the Allied commander, rode forward to survey the aftermath. He was a man under immense pressure, having nearly lost the battle. But the sight of the 57th stopped him cold. He watched as the handful of survivors, dazed and deafened, attempted to close ranks and prepare to pursue the French, instinctively obeying the drum despite their exhaustion. Beresford, overcome by the sheer scale of their sacrifice, reportedly turned to his staff and murmured, "Stop the 57th. It would be a sin to let them go on." They had done enough. They had done more than enough. The regimental colour, the sacred object Colonel Inglis had lain before, was retrieved from the carnage. It was unrecognisable. The yellow silk was blackened by powder burns and stained with the blood of the ensigns who had carried it. Later, when the survivors sat down to count the damage, they found 21 bullet holes through the fabric. The staff itself, the wooden pole, had been fractured by a musket ball but splintered together, much like the regiment itself. Colonel Inglis survived his wounds, though he would carry the scars for the rest of his life. He was carried off the field, not as a commander of a line regiment, but as the patriarch of a legend. The men of the West Middlesex had marched up the hill as the Steelbacks, known for their ability to take a flogging. They came down as the diehards, known for their ability to take the worst the Napoleonic Wars could offer. The name stuck instantly. It was not granted by royal decree or official proclamation. It was earned in the blood and mud of Albuera, and it would become the defining identity of the regiment for the next century. But the legacy of the diehards was not just a story for the history books. It was a spirit that would lie dormant, waiting for the next time the Empire demanded a miracle. 4 decades pass. The redcoats remain, though the cut has changed, and the Brown Bess musket has been replaced by the rifled musket, capable of killing at distances the veterans of Spain could scarcely imagine. But the soul of the regiment remains trapped in the amber of 1811. The legend of the diehards has been passed down from the scarred survivors of the peninsula to a new generation of recruits. In the barracks, Young privates are told the story of Colonel Inglis and the Hill of Death. They are taught that they belong to a unit that does not run, a unit that possesses a peculiar ownership over the concept of sacrifice. In November 1854, on the freezing slopes of the Crimea, that inheritance is called upon once again. The Battle of Inkerman is distinct in the annals of British military history. It is known as the Soldiers' Battle, a chaotic, swirling melee fought in a dense, freezing fog that robbed generals of their vision and officers of their tactical control. There are no grand manoeuvres here, no clear lines of sight. It is a brawl in the mud, fought by isolated companies and battalions desperately trying to hold back the grey tide of the Russian Imperial Army. The Russians, utilising the cover of the mist, have launched a massive surprise attack against the British positions surrounding the besieged city of Sevastopol. The 57th Regiment finds itself in the thick of this confusion. The terrain is treacherous, scrubby ravines and rocky outcrops, shrouded in a vapour so thick that a man can barely see the bayonet at the end of his rifle. The regiment is fragmented, cut off from high command, fighting a defensive action against overwhelming numbers. Russian infantry, clad in drab greatcoats, emerge from the fog like ghosts, surging forward in heavy columns, their approach muffled until they are almost on top of the British line. The situation mirrors the crisis of Albuera with haunting precision. The 57th is outnumbered. They are taking heavy fire. The men are exhausted, freezing and wet. The instinct to pull back, to find a better position, to seek safety in the rear is overwhelming. The line begins to waver. It is that fragile moment in combat where a unit either solidifies or disintegrates. The pressure is immense. The Russian musketry is chipping away at the company's strength, and the officers can see the fear growing in the eyes of their men. It is amidst this sensory deprivation tank of war that Captain Edward Stanley, commanding one of the companies, realizes that tactical commands are useless. In the roar and the fog, orders about flanking fire or formation changes mean nothing. He needs to reach something deeper. He needs to unlock the psychological trigger that has been drilled into these men since the day they took the King's shilling. Stanley draws his sword, stepping to the front of the wavering line. He does not appeal to king or country. He screams a phrase that is specific only to them, a code word for ultimate resistance. Men, remember Albuera! The effect is instantaneous and primal. The shout cuts through the fog and the fear. Most of the men standing there were not even born when Colonel Inglis lay bleeding in Spain. They have never seen the ridge at Albuera, but they know what it means. It is the identity of their tribe. To retreat now, after hearing that name, would be a betrayal not just of their current duty, but of the ghosts who watch over them. The hesitation vanishes. The die-hard spirit, dormant for years of peace, ignites with ferocious intensity. The 57th does not just hold, they counterattack. Fixing bayonets, they charge into the grey mist, screaming as they run. They slam into the Russian columns with a violence that stuns the enemy. It is a collision of morale as much as metal. The Russians, expecting the British line to crumble, are instead met by a demonic fury. The men of the 57th fight with the desperation of men who cannot allow their history to be tarnished. Stanley falls, killed in the charge, joining the roster of the regiment's martyrs. But his words have done their work. The Russian advance is blunted. The diehards clear their front, securing the flank of the army in one of the most critical engagements of the war. As the fog eventually lifts and the battle dies down, the survivors of Inkerman stand amidst the rocky scrub, breathing the cold air of survival. They have proven that the events of 1811 were not a fluke. The die-hard myth is not just a story told to recruits. It is a living, breathing, operational doctrine. The regiment has demonstrated that names have power, and that a legacy, properly invoked, is as lethal a weapon as any rifle. The legacy of the 57th Regiment extends far beyond the tactical mathematics of a single ridge in Spain or a foggy morning in the Crimea. It speaks to the very heart of the British regimental system, a psychological machine designed to turn ordinary, often marginalized men into cohesive fighting units. The story of the diehards is the ultimate validation of this system. It demonstrates that an identity, once forged in extreme trauma, can become a tangible inheritance, passed down like a piece of kit from one generation to the next. In the years following the Napoleonic Wars, the die-hard moniker ceased to be a mere nickname. It became the regiment's secular religion. For a recruit joining the 57th in the Victorian era, the weight of history was immediate and crushing. A young man from the slums of London, taking the Queen's shilling to escape poverty or the law, was no longer just a private in the infantry. He was a custodian of the memory of Colonel Inglis. He was being initiated into a tribe that defined itself by a singular, terrifying standard: the refusal to move. This identity was reinforced by the visual symbols of the unit. The yellow facings on their red coats were not just decoration. They marked the wearer as a member of the West Middlesex, the men who stood still. But the most potent symbol was the regimental colour itself. The original flag carried at Albuera, the one riddled with 21 musket balls and stained with the blood of its bearers, was eventually retired. However, it was not discarded. It was preserved as a holy relic, a physical testament to the price of the regiment's reputation. When new colours were presented, they were consecrated in the shadow of the old ones, ensuring the continuity of the spirit. The regiment's culture also embraced its rougher edges. They never lost the reputation of being the steelbacks. Throughout the 19th century, the 57th maintained a reputation for hardness that could be problematic in peacetime. They were known for heavy drinking, brawling, and a fierce, insular pride. They were, as Inglis had affectionately called them, fighting villains. But the British Army understood the value of such men. The officers knew that the same aggression and stubbornness that led to trouble in the garrison towns were the exact traits required to hold a line against a Zulu impi or a Russian column. The villainy was a feature, not a bug. This unique die-hard brand created a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because the regiment was expected to be immovable, the men believed themselves to be immovable. In military psychology, this is a powerful force. When a soldier believes he belongs to an elite caste of survivors, he is less likely to break under pressure. The fear of death is superseded by the fear of letting down the die-hard name. It is a form of peer pressure weaponized for war. The ghost of Colonel Inglis effectively served as the permanent, unseen commander of the battalion, his order to die hard echoing through every subsequent engagement. It is also worth noting the specific tactical niche the 57th occupied. They were never the glamour boys of the army. They did not have the dashing green uniforms of the 95th Rifles, nor the romantic allure of the Highland regiments with their kilts and pipes. They were the line. They were the PBI, poor bloody infantry. Their job was unglamorous, brutal, and essential. They were the anvil against which the enemy was smashed. The die-hard story elevated this grim duty into something noble. It told the common infantryman that his job, standing in the mud and being shot at, was the highest form of soldiering. As the 19th century wound down and the nature of warfare began to change with the advent of machine guns and high explosives, the tactical utility of the human wall diminished. Standing shoulder to shoulder became suicide rather than doctrine. Yet the spirit remained. The 57th Regiment would eventually be amalgamated into the Middlesex Regiment, but the nickname survived. The diehards continued to fight in the trenches of the First World War and the campaigns of the Second, carrying the yellow facings and the memory of the Ridge into the modern age. But the core of the legend remains anchored in that 4-hour period in 1811, where a single regiment proved that the human will is stronger than iron. Today, the ridge at Albuera is a quiet place. The mud that once sucked the boots off dying men has long since dried, covered by the gentle, rolling farmland of the Spanish countryside. Olive groves whisper in the wind where canister shot once screamed. A monument stands there now, a silent sentinel of stone dedicated to the men who fell on that wet May morning. But to stand on that slope is to feel the weight of a history that transcends the landscape. It is a place where the earth itself seems to remember the pressure of the human wall that refused to break. The story of the 57th Regiment of Foot is more than just a chapter in the history of the Peninsular War. It is the definitive biography of the British soldier in the Age of Empire. It is a study in the alchemy of discipline, the strange, brutal process that could take these scum of the earth, as Wellington called them, and transmute them into gold. The men of the West Middlesex were not born heroes. They were hard men from a hard world, familiar with the cruelty of the lash and the poverty of the street. Yet, when placed in the crucible of Albuera, they displayed a nobility of spirit that humbled kings and generals alike. The legacy of the diehards challenges our modern understanding of warfare. In an age of drone strikes and precision engagement, the idea of standing in a too-deep line, motionless, while being dismantled by artillery fire seems like madness. It appears to be a waste of life on an industrial scale. But to the men of the 57th, it was the ultimate expression of professional pride. They did not fight for geopolitics. They did not fight for the intricate maneuvering of the campaign map. They fought for the man to their left, the man to their right, and the tattered yellow silk flying above their heads. They fought because to leave the line was to lose the only thing they truly owned, their reputation. The visible remnants of that day are few. The uniforms have rotted away. The muskets have rusted into the earth. But the regimental colours, those silent witnesses to the slaughter, remain. In the quiet gloom of English cathedrals and regimental chapels, the successors to the original flags hang suspended in the stillness. The silk is often gone, leaving only the bare mesh, fragile and ghost-like. Yet, in those tattered threads, the story is preserved. They are the physical receipts of the butcher's bill paid by the 57th. They are a reminder that the map of Europe was drawn not just with ink, but with the blood of men who stood their ground when every instinct screamed at them to run. The 57th Regiment would eventually be amalgamated, its name changing as the army modernised and contracted. They became the Middlesex Regiment, and later part of the Princess of Wales's Royal Regiment. But in the genealogy of the British Army, the DNA of the diehards remains a dominant strain. The name itself has entered the lexicon of the English language, a shorthand for stubborn resistance against impossible odds. But for the soldiers, it is specific. It is the memory of Colonel Inglis bleeding into the mud, refusing to close his eyes until he knew the line would hold. As the sun sets over the ridge at Albuera today, casting long shadows across the valley, one can almost imagine the phantom ranks reforming in the mist. The ghostly beat of the drum, the smell of wet wool and black powder, and the yellow facings glowing in the dim light. They are still there, standing shoulder to shoulder, eternal in their vigilance. They are the 57th. They are the steelbacks. They are the diehards. And in the silence of history, their command echoes louder than the roar of any cannon. To stand, to suffer, and if necessary, to die hard, so that the line remains unbroken. Thank you for listening to our story. If you found this history as fascinating as we did, please like this video and subscribe to British War History for more. We read all of your comments, so be sure to leave your thoughts below. We'll see you in the next video.